Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Thank you for joining us to hear Dr. Sofia Moskalenko. Her talk today will be entitled Deadly Disinformation, the Role of Ideology in Political Violence. Chai Mitzvah, a national organization now celebrating its 15th year, is the sponsor of Scholar Circle. We are a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement, programs, and materials. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, which can be lay or professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book along with the accompanying curriculum, which has been taught to hundreds of college students and others for only $18 on our website at chaimitzvah.org or at your favorite bookstore. The curriculum was also taught and recorded in a series by Dr. Andrew Pessin. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues facing the Jewish community. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We are excited to continue the Scholar Circle program as we enter our second year, and we need your support to keep it thriving. Scholar Circle has engaged over 2,000 participants alone this year. Your contribution will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. Please visit chaimitzvah.org and click on the gold menu tab, Scholar Circle, and select Support Scholar Circle. This will also be included in your follow-up email. Thank you for considering supporting this engaging program for all. And I'd like to say that it is our commitment to bring these scholars and their work to the general public. Too often these scholars speak to themselves, and our commitment is to support them through honorariums for being part of the Scholar Circle. So anything you can give would be much appreciated. And thank you in advance. Our featured scholar today is Dr. Sofia Moskalenko, who is a social and clinical psychologist studying radicalization, political violence, self-sacrifice, and disinformation. She is a senior research scientist at Design Services Group, DSG, a research fellow at the Georgia State University, and a subject matter expert at NATO, the European Commission, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism Behavioral Insights, HUB. Dr. Moskalenko has published over 70 peer-reviewed academic papers and several books, including the award-winning Friction, How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, and Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Sofia Moskalenko.
Hello. Thank you for welcoming me at Scholar Circle, and thank you everyone who came to hear me speak today in the middle of a very busy holiday season, and happy holidays to you all. So let me just take a moment to share my screen with you. If I may. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about deadly disinformation and how conspiracy theories can and sometimes do inspire political violence. This research has been supported by the Department of Defense Minerva grant, for which I'm very grateful, but none of the opinions I express here today represent the Department of Defense or any of the entities I'm associated with. They're entirely my own. And over the last few years, it's become easier and easier to explain to people why it is the Department of Defense would sponsor research on disinformation. Because, after all, we understand that these are just stories. They're fiction. They're a figment of someone's imagination. And we also have heard this saying that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And so, can words ever hurt? That's the topic for today. And before we get into that, let's just for a second understand together what disinformation is. Because there's so many different words flying around, misinformation, disinformation. I just want to be clear that if you ask me, for example, what time it is, and I tell you it's 3 p.m., that is false information. It's not necessarily disinformation. That depends on whether I am aware that it's not actually 3 p.m. for you or for me. If I'm genuinely mistaken about that, then what I'm giving you is misinformation. But if I'm telling you a falsehood in order to mislead you, then that is what I call in this presentation disinformation. And the second question is, okay, well, disinformation, how deadly can it be, really? Is it just a figure of speech? So I am going to present to you several major case studies about disinformational narratives that were extremely deadly. I'm going to tell you exactly how deadly they are. And in each case study, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the circumstances surrounding the spread of this disinformation and also the content of this disinformation. And we're going to try to see if there is a pattern that we can decipher across these different case studies that can tell us something about what makes some narratives dangerous and deadly, about the time of their appearance, the circumstance of their appearance, or their content. So the first piece of disinformation I'm going to tell you about appeared in the 1500s in Germany, in the German city of Speyer. You see the cover of this book, the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the witch's hammer. It was written by a German clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, who claimed in this book that there were widespread instances of practicing witchcraft and that he had firsthand information about who could be identified as a witch, by what conditions, and what exactly witches do. And in the book, he presents interviews with people that he claimed were witches who told him about all of this. The book also helpfully presents 3 criteria which can help anybody, any layperson, to identify a practicing witch. These 3 criteria, this is now the content, right? These 3 criteria include: this is a witch if they roasted their firstborn male child, condition number 1. Condition number 2, it's a witch if they made a formal pact with the devil. So far, so good. Sounds reasonable. Condition number 3 is it's a witch if they are actively depriving men of their vital member. It is exactly what it sounds like, and it's weird, and we're going to get back to it. In addition to these 3 helpful conditions for anybody to go practice their own witch hunt, the book included, like I said, firsthand accounts of these practicing witches, which described in gory detail how they stole children and then used them for nefarious things. So here's a quote: "We prey on babies, especially those not yet baptized, but also those baptized." So a baptized baby is not safe, right? "With our ceremonies, we kill them in their cribs or while they lie beside their parents. So it won't even be safe if you put the baby next to you at night. And while they're thought to have been squashed or have died of something else, we steal them secretly from the tomb and boil them in a cauldron. until all the flesh is made drinkable, the bones having been pulled out, pretty disgusting. From the more solid matter, we make a paste suitable for our desires and arts and movement by flight, so it enables them to fly. And from the more runny liquid, we make a container. Whoever drinks from this container is immediately rendered knowledgeable when a few ceremonies are added and becomes a master of our sect. So, pretty disgusting and gory and scary stuff. And lucky for us all, we would think very soon after this book came out, it was identified as a fraud. So two well-known and well-respected members of Heinrich Kramer's parish came out and said that to their knowledge, there were no cases of missing babies stolen from the tomb or elsewhere, that they didn't know of a single practicing witch that was identified by Kramer, and that in fact Kramer was himself excommunicated from his church because of his unhealthy and disturbing obsessions with women. So you would think that would put an end to the spread of this particular disinformation narrative. But in fact, it was a tremendous success. So it was printed in 20 separate editions between 1486 and 1520, and another 16 editions between 1520 and 1669. So this is on the par with things like Harry Potter, how widespread and popular this book became. Well, okay, it seems like an engaging story, kind of scary story. What's so bad about that? How deadly could this be? So according to historical records, this book was used to prosecute and kill about 60,000 people, put to death. This is not counting, this is just death records. That doesn't count people who were imprisoned, tortured, or otherwise ill-affected by this book. And 80 to 90% of those put to death, the 60,000, were women. So mostly women suffered. Okay, what is interesting and potentially relevant for us to understand this popularity and effect about the circumstances of its appearance? So this book came out at a time of tremendous religious turmoil. This is when the wars between Protestants and Catholics were raging in Europe, what we read about, 100-year war, 30-year war, smaller conflicts everywhere, all around. There was fighting, and there were waves of refugees seeking safety and abandoning places that were ravaged by the fighting. So political turmoil. Number two, at the same time as the book was spreading, there were a number of tremendous epidemics and pandemics. So the Black Death, the first pandemic, Black Death, was ended, but it was still very fresh in people's memories. And the second wave of it was just beginning. And at the same time, also happening were localized epidemics of smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, and cholera. So the second thing that it might be important for us to remember is that this book was spreading at a time of these pandemics and epidemics. And the third thing that's also very important is that just 30 years prior to this book coming out, the Gutenberg press was invented. A press that enabled mass production of books. So if you imagine yourself in the early 1500s, the only book that you probably have ever seen, probably not even held, but seen, is the book, the Bible. And the Bible holds this universal authority, and it has almost a magic sheen around it, right? So not only is it the truth, but it's the divine truth. So this publication probably was in the kind of basking in reflected glory of the Bible for people who were reading it. The Bible being the only book, this was coming soon on its heels. Most people haven't even held a book before this. This informational technology boosted the popularity and the believability and the sacredness of the information that it carried. So that's case study number one. Case study number two, I'm sorry, switch slides. Case study number two came out of the Russian Empire. in 1903. And it was called, and you probably know it, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This is the cover of this. It came out not as a book, but as an expose in a factory newspaper's Znamia. So at this time, newspapers became popularized in Russia, where before it was just something that the nobility read in their leisurely time. But at this same time as the pamphlet was published, Russia was undergoing rapid industrialization. So hundreds of thousands of peasants were forcibly uprooted from their villages and their families and brought into these factory towns around the cities where they were living in squalid conditions and were pretty much enslaved. The system of payment made it so they couldn't very well leave where they were living. And in order to kind of entertain them and take their minds off in the best traditions of the Roman Caesars, to give them bread and circuses, this factory newspaper was introduced, which was published on very cheap, kind of yellowish paper, and it contained entertainment things. So this was something like that. But like the previous case study, it claimed that it was authentic. It claimed that it contained first-hand information about a conspiracy by the Jewish elites around the world to control the world, to take over and control the world. And it claimed that there were several conditions that the Jews were seeking to effect. This is a long list. Russians are, they like long novels, but I'll just give you 3 of the 12. Number 1 is that the Jews will want to banish God from the heavens and Christianity from the earth. Very ambitious. Number 2, to abolish marriage, family, and home, to encourage sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, adultery, and fornication. That's weird, right? There's this weird element about these things you will notice, but we'll get to it soon enough. Another condition is to circulate vulgar pornographic literature and picture and encourage the unrestricted sale and general use of alcoholic beverages and drugs to weaken and corrupt the youth. And the last one I'll tell you is foment, precipitate, and finance large-scale wars to emasculate and bankrupt the Gentiles. So, okay, again, as soon as it came out, very quickly, there were several investigations that discovered that this was a fraud produced by the Russian Empire's Tsar's secret police service. So it was publicized that it was a fraud, and you would think that that would have an effect, but you know where this is going. It definitely didn't. And to this day, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is probably, along with the Mein Kampf, the #1 piece of anti-Semitic literature that is very popular in right-wing and neo-fascist and all kinds of anti-Semitic circles. And after it came out, it is believed to have been at least in part responsible or featured in identifiable discourse in precipitation of more than 650 deadly anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire. So this is counting pogroms, 650 pogroms that were deadly, that included mortalities. We don't have any better information than that because Russians are not great about keeping track of their dead, let alone their dead Jews. But you can only imagine this caused a huge wave of immigration into the West. And probably if you know some Jews who have more than 1 generation or 2 generations in the United States or the West, you will find that a lot of them come from that wave of immigration that was in response to the pogroms that were themselves inspired by this pamphlet. What else was happening around this time that it became so popular? I already told you about the industrialization. So it created a huge population of people who were disconnected, discontent, and very angry. And in fact, in 1905, this was published in 1903, and just 2 years later, Russia experienced the first of a series of revolutions that resulted in Bolsheviks coming into power. So a lot of political unrest. Also, Russia just lost the war with Japan. So if you remember the map, the size of Russia and the size of Japan, the loss of this huge country to this tiny little country was an enormous humiliation. It was kind of a watershed moment that crumbled a lot of Russians' perceptions of the greatness of their nation. And the Russian soldiers that were coming back from the front were bringing with them the epidemic of typhus and what was then known as the Russian flu, but what we now know was probably the first instantiation of the coronavirus. So there were huge epidemics spreading all around Russia, a lot of political discontent. And finally, I want to emphasize again that the newspaper was a new medium of communication, that to these people who were living in worse than animal conditions in these factory towns was something akin to approaching their former masters. Most of these people were illiterate. Most of these people never held a book or a newspaper in their hands. So this was them being able to get a handle on the world beyond their experience, on something greater and fantastic, a kind of magic sheen on it. They were doing their own research. They were able to find things out that they couldn't before. So the third case study I'm going to talk to you about, you probably already heard if you're coming to these High Mitzvahs talks, and that is the case of QAnon, which started out as these Q drops. What you see on your screen are two examples of messages that appeared on internet messenger board like 4chan and 8chan in late 2017. And you can see for yourself that they're quite nonsensical and they look like somebody in a psychotic break just typing down things. And at first there was very little response to them. So today we can trace how many people engaged with these posts. And we can see that from late 2017 until about 2020, there was almost no engagement with these. However, in early 2020, we all remember COVID happened, and with it, the government mandated lockdowns. And this is where we see a huge jump in the number of people who comment on these things, forward them to others, and somehow engage with them. And also at this moment in the early 2020, we see these things migrate from the far off internet corners like 4chan to mainstream social media like Instagram and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and so on. And we see that after 2020, the number of people engaging and interacting with these posts grows to tens of millions of followers just in the US, and it spreads worldwide. What do these people say once they, decipher these things and, figure out the meaning behind them? They say that Jews rule the world via a secret cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, that they organize and kidnap and torture children in order to harvest their blood that they use to enhance their vitality and abilities and so on. That they sexually abuse children. And a lot of other things. I'll get to it in 1 second. Among them, that the COVID vaccine, which you remember came out after the COVID lockdowns, will make people gay or maybe infertile. And I hope that you're already associating some of these features of the content with the features that I described earlier, because there are a lot of parallels. So how deadly was QAnon really? For most of us, QAnon came into our worldview as a result of January 6th breach of the Capitol Hill. And at that event, we know that two people were killed. Both of them were women, and both of them were QAnon believers. And of course, we know that a lot of people were injured, among them 140 police officers, and two of them committed suicide in the aftermath. But that doesn't describe the actual death toll of QAnon, because for that we need to look a little broader, and know that there are estimates by epidemiologists and economists in the hundreds of thousands of excess deaths that were related to COVID followers' refusal to maintain um, protocols for distancing and mask wearing, and especially their refusal to vaccinate themselves and their children, and some of them drinking bleach and ingesting horse dewormer, which resulted in some mortalities and so on. So this is the jump that I was talking to you about. So you can see at the beginning in 2017, kind of a flat line as far as engagement with QAnon material. And then you see a precipitous increase right around the time when COVID lockdowns were instituted. And you can see it across the various platforms. That's the graph on the right with all the green lines. And this is a graphic that represents all kinds of different narratives that QAnon embraces. Some of them are directly self-contradicting. So, there's a narrative that says that COVID is a hoax. It's just a seasonal flu, and they're blowing it out of proportion in order to, and then, it goes on what the purported goal is. But then a different QAnon narrative says that COVID was actually a biological weapon that was developed in a Chinese lab with the funding from NATO or the US or whatever. So it can be both a hoax and a biological weapon. But in QAnon, you get a lot of very contradictory narratives, disjointed narratives, which is what makes it kind of easy to attract a lot of people. You don't have to believe a particular thing. You can pick and choose. It's kind of a clearinghouse of narratives. And this is, of course, the January 6th riot. And you can see the person in the front of that picture is wearing a shirt with a QAnon insignia on the front, which is why January 6th became so associated with QAnon, because a lot of participants were easily identified as QAnon followers with the flags that they carried, or their shirts, or their hats, or their slogans. So across the three case studies that I presented to you, there are some commonalities in antecedent conditions. Namely, they tend to appear during times of political upheaval, whether it's religious wars or fomenting revolutionary movements or political changes or fragmentation like we have in the United States and polarization of the culture. They tend to be preceded and accompanied by major epidemics or pandemics, and they tend to be facilitated by a novel informational technology. So this is my little mnemonic of the three horsemen of a deadly disinformation. Epidemics, new information technology, and political change tend to foretell that a disinformation narrative can become very deadly. And we can wonder, why it is that these three things can make a narrative deadly. And psychology can helpfully offer information about that. So during political upheavals, one thing that happens is there's a loss of certainty about what the future holds, and a lack of control that sets in. Revolutions and wars and fragmentations and changes in the political climate of the country leave an average person feeling kind of lost and uncertain. And we know from psychology research that long preceded QAnon that if we put a person in a lab in a situation where they're made to feel uncertain and out of control, and then we introduce to them some event and offer them different options for how to explain it, the person who's feeling out of control and uncertain are a lot more likely to entertain conspiratorial narratives, and they're a lot more likely to believe them than people who are not made to feel uncertain and out of control. Because uncertainty and out of control feels unsettling and bad, and conspiratorial narratives give us a sense that at least if it's not, if the world is not perfect, at least there is an order. Somebody's behind all of these bad things. So we can take them down and make things good again, or whatever. But it gives a sense of purposefulness and order that people severely lack. Second, epidemics and pandemics, and we can reflect back to how we experienced COVID. they result in a feeling of isolation. And certainly the lockdowns did for a lot of individuals, right? You're cut off from other people because you don't want to get sick. And again, we know from psychology research that feeling socially alienated or isolated, either dispositionally, because you're kind of a loner, or situationally, makes somebody a lot more likely to engage in conspiratorial mindset and to endorse it. And finally, the new informational technology. And here I think what matters is this idea of almost a magical source. Now, we're all adults and we don't believe in magic, maybe, but we really believe in something else that is like that. And psychology research calls that awe, something that is vast and incomprehensible. It could be God, it could be science, something out there that makes everything seem kind of trivial, but by comparison. And so whether it comes in the form of a book to somebody who's never seen a book, or in the form of a newspaper to somebody who's never ever read or held a newspaper, or in the form of the social media to the generation of people for whom the social media is still terra incognita, it carries that sheen of magic. And awe is not always good. Sometimes it's terrifying awe. And research on terrifying awe, contemplating things like the Holocaust or a horrible natural disaster, makes people feel ready to engage in violence to protect themselves and their loved ones. So those are the reasons that I think these three environmental conditions are instrumental for making a narrative deadly. We can also wonder if this is a supply or demand issue, meaning, are we just more creative during the times of political upheavals and epidemics? Do we just create more of these narratives, and sooner or later, one of them is bound to do this? Or, this is supply side, or is it a demand issue? We're just more gullible, more affected by these things. And I think it's the latter. And the reason I think that is because the witch trials predated the witch's hammer by hundreds of years. The Inquisition had already done that, been there. Um, so it's not like it was a new idea. The idea existed a long time before the witch's hammer did. Same thing with the idea of anti-Semitism in Russia. It existed not just in Russia, but it's always been around. And the blood libel is hundreds of years older than the protocols of the Elder of Zion. So it wasn't a new idea. The idea existed beforehand. And among the QAnon narratives, not a single one is original. It's all borrowed. Some of them from the blood libel or protocols of Elders of Zion or flat earth from the Inquisition time. So these are not new ideas. It's just that the environment into which these seeds fall is a lot more receptive to them. And the second thing we talked about is the content of these narratives. And there too are three conditions that I think are important for understanding why they became deadly. These commonalities include that all these three narratives present the target of the narrative as essentially evil. This is my attempt at essentially evil. Why is that relevant to understand the deadliness of this epidemic? So in psychology research, there's this thing called essentialization. It's a developmental milestone. Until the age of about 4, kids can't really tell that, a cat will not grow up to be a dog, or, a boy is not going to grow up to be a girl. I'm putting aside gender issues for a second. And around age 4, they start understanding that there's something inside of people that makes them who they are, inside of animals that make them who they are, that is unchangeable, their essence. And when something or someone is painted as essentially bad, when a narrative presents a group of people as monsters or disgusting animals, or dangerous predators, this is something inside them that can't be changed, that makes them who they are, and it's essentially evil. The only logical step from that is to eliminate these people or this thing. And indeed, we find that higher essentialization in psychology research predicts higher endorsement of violent action against a particular group of people. And essentialization marked every single genocide of which we have record, including the Holocaust, but also the Rwandan genocide and the genocide of Ukrainians in Russian right now, by Russians right now. The second condition of these three case studies I presented is that it talks about threatened and harmed children, either stolen or killed, or tortured or sexually abused. Um, and I think the reason that that is really important is that children are mnemonically and kind of, idiomatically, they represent the innocence, right? So when somebody threatens or harms innocence, again, the only logical implication is that they're fundamentally evil, which feeds into the first condition. But I think there's more to be said about children. And that is that children are also idiomatically are the future. And if you think back to the small, more primordial community, it's not just idiomatically the children are their future. There are the actual future of that community. If the children of that community are led astray and killed or made unable to reproduce, that community will cease to exist. So a threat to children is an existential threat. And in psychology research, again, it's very clear when people are encountering existential threats, they're a lot more prone to endorse violence and to engage in violence for preservation of themselves or their community. And finally, this is the peculiar, really strange thing about emasculation, whether it's literally depriving men of their vital member or it's turning children into homosexuals, or turning them to depravity or sexually abusing them, which was the QAnon narrative. It features in all of these narratives, and the question is, why would it? What does it get for these narratives? And the answer to that, I think, is in the psychology research on what's called precarious manhood or fragile masculinity. It's a trait that some men have, not all, some men believe that masculinity is not a given, that it can be taken away, and that you should be alert to threats to your masculinity, and you should assert it and defend it if you feel threatened. And we find in psychology research that people who are high on that threat, on that trait, when they feel a threat to their masculinity, are a lot more likely to do three things. One, they're a lot more likely to endorse authoritarian leaders. Two, they're a lot more likely to support war as a method of resolution of political conflicts. And three, they're a lot more likely to engage in physical violence when they perceive a threat to themselves. So I think these three psychological interpretations of the content lead us to understand a little better why it's relevant for how deadly these narratives were. Now I'm gonna skip forward to something that's happening right now. This has been ongoing for about more than a decade. Russia is spreading a huge disinformation campaign that's centered around LGBTQ population, which is very much persecuted in Russia. But this campaign is not limited to Russia. It reaches beyond its borders. And it says that LGBTQ is coming from the West. It's something that the West wants to spread, that it's connected with devil worship. So this is a centralization and evil nature, right? That it's contagious, that it's easy to catch it if you're not careful, and that it's dangerous to children. So here is a cartoon that the official Russian embassy in the UK tweeted. And it represents Russia on the one hand as this hyper-masculinized bear, and the EU on the other side with the LGBT flag, looking kind of gender amorphous and quite disgusting. And the gates are reminiscent of the Auschwitz gates. And Russia, of course, is a land of plenty and all gorgeous. There were a bunch of hearings in the Russian Duma, which is kind of their parliament, which, for example, accused the makers of this milk carton of spreading LGBTQ propaganda to Russian children, which is a criminal offense and a very serious one in Russia. This was another criminal case that was hearings about it were held in Duma about a bank card for children that, again, they said was proselytizing children into LGBTQ. This was a major Russian television channel report about newly captured territories in Ukraine, where they claim to have discovered centers for conversion into LGBTQ that produced materials that specifically targeted children. And wouldn't you know it, at these same centers, there were items for devil worship. This is a satanic worship paraphernalia. And of course, no big surprise, but this was, they say, funded by the US aid. So when we ran a study of Russian adults and we asked them questions that measured their precarious manhood, this is the lowest line here, and we also asked them about their intentions for radical, meaning illegal and violent political action, and for their activist action, which is legal and nonviolent, we find that precarious manhood or womanhood, because there's a version of the scale for women too, it correlates positively and significantly with radical intentions, meaning the higher you are on the precarious manhood beliefs, the more likely you are to endorse illegal and violent political action. And if you think that what happens in Russia stays in Russia, you would be wrong. Here's a tweet from Donald Trump Jr. on, notice, October 7th at 12:53 p.m. American time, which means this was still unfolding in Israel. What does he say? He says, as we perpetually indoctrinate our children with weakness, feminize our boys, attack masculine men, glorify trans insanity, just understand that one day the savages you see brutally attacking innocent children in the streets of Israel will be on your front door, and you and your loved ones will have zero capability of defending themselves. That's the future the left is creating for you. And I know I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to show you this last slide, which surveyed American adults, and we asked them about 3 disinformation campaigns about October 7th that surfaced in its wake. And we also asked them about a scale that measured their anti-Semitism. We asked them about their radical intentions. And finally, we asked them how much they admire people who tore down those posters about kidnapped Israelis that were held by Hamas. Okay, so these are the results. The last 3 lines on this table represent the 3 conspiracy theories. The first one, the hospital bomb, said that Israel bombed a hospital in Gaza. This was even published in the New York Times. It was later retracted, but as we know, that doesn't always help this information to spread. The second one is that the Israeli military action in Gaza is actually a replacement effort to push Palestinians into Europe and America and replace white men there. And the last one was that the photos of killed babies, Israeli babies by Hamas were faked. So you can see that all these 3 correlate very highly and very positively with anti-Semitism, which is the first column. Probably not surprisingly for you, but you would believe me if I tell you that it's surprising for some of my audiences. They also correlate very highly and positively with radical intentions of Americans, meaning intentions for illegal and violent action. And finally, this is number 4, they correlate with admiration for people who took down the posters of kidnapped Israeli children. In other words, these disinformation narratives represent very much everything I told you about how disinformation campaigns can and do sometimes become deadly. And it's not just our history, it's our present, and we have to be vigilant and we have to act against it. And I know I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you so much. There are many questions. I'm going to try to group them a little bit. There's a lot of questions about disinformation itself. So one question I thought was interesting. It says from Roz Schurenstein, how many people were actually able to read? If not many, would a book like Hammer or Witches mainly have affected clergy and other educated, wealthy people? And I think this is really interesting to think about who are the social influencers when you are doing a disinformation campaign. How important is it that the people that have the power, the people who are educated, social influences in our today, people who are social influences, how important is that in targeting a successful disinformation campaign?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think probably not a lot of people were able to read, but remember, not a lot of people were allowed to read the Bible in those times, right? The religious wars were about the fact that Catholics wouldn't allow their people to read the Bible. So that didn't stop them from believing the narrative, right? And the workers in Imperial Russia certainly couldn't read, vast majority of them. So I think sometimes, just having somebody read this to you, like they did with the newspaper, they had a person who would read the newspaper to a room full of people. Um, can be even more powerful, this exclusive source that most of us can't actually access gives it an even greater influence, which gets us to influencers, right? So I think, leaving something to the imagination sometimes can make the imagination run overdrive. And, um, you know, in fact, those people who can actually do research as opposed to do their own research are able to determine falsehoods when they see them. So it's only when we can't actually get at the bottom line that we can be swayed by the message as profoundly false and evidently so for these people as these examples.
So it does remind me of the media today and why we do the Scholar's Circle, because there is so much in our media today that seems to spread disinformation, um, even from trusted sources. So this is a problem. How do you distinguish between disinformation? And there is a question about this. What is the difference? The term disinformation signals intentional provocation. How do we distinguish this from simple ignorance or bigotry? And I'd like to extend that question to how do you distinguish that from things in our media that are just, wrong, not intentional, but just ignorance or bigotry.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a great answer. However, I think there are layers of disinformation. And Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution and one of the best fibbers of all time, right? He had the saying, "Useful idiots."
Mm.
So the influencers cannot do it alone. They rely on an army of useful idiots who are fearlessly spreading their message. Um, and so, yeah, it is ignorance, um, and these people are being manipulated, and then other people are being manipulated by them. Um, and I think, going to the origins of the question, um, I think the breakdown in trust is, and a kind of feeling of uncertainty and lack of control is the most important feature, that allows the spread of deadly disinformation. So with the influx of different kinds of information, which these new informational technologies bring about, and also influx of people, these refugees, whether they come from the war or from economically devastated regions, they bring strangers into our communities, into our lands, and we start being apprehensive. It's a normal human reaction. And of course, diseases make us apprehensive in a whole different, primordial, almost animal way. So I think building trust is the best we can hope for, creating our community, which is what you're doing. And I thank you for that in Scholar Circle, but also, having your circle of trust and expanding it as far as you can gives you that sense of control and reduces uncertainty and makes you less likely to fall prey to somebody's manipulation, whether it's unwitting or intentional.
Mhm. Right. So to talk a little bit more about the psychological influences, there are some questions about anger. What role does anger play in the acceptance of these deadly lies? And I'm interested too, because the slide that you talked about with Trump and the attack on males that you spoke about, there's been a lot of research about the anger that white males feel in this country with industrialization, people who are not college educated, people who have seemed to be bypassed. And so we talk a lot, there's a lot of research about the lack of ability for your average white male who has not gone to college to actually make a living, to actually support their family. So what role does anger and this maybe justified anger play in accepting these deadly lies?
Yeah, so my last lecture for you, I talked a lot about these breakdowns in social norms around gender that happened in the United States, and the Me Too movement and the fluidity of gender that is now like we have to accept it, and we have to learn to speak in a different way, and we have to accept that marriages are not just between a man and a woman, because those are laws now, right? And so this is kind of a fundamental truth that was foundational to a lot of people's um, idea of themselves growing up. They thought, they would be a real man and support a family, and they can't, like in the 1950s, a single man can't go get a factory job and support a family of four, buy a house and two cars. So it's not just that the incomes are down, it's also that the expectations are still up, right? So it's the expectation of what a real man should do, and the feeling of deprivation that men who put that expectation on themselves have, and the resentment toward women who are taking over some jobs, or in the case of incels, it's the resentment that women have a choice over which men they pick, or they don't pick me or whatever, right? So I think there is a lot to be angry about at any given time in history. If you're talking about 100 years ago, they probably had it worse than we do now. And if you got sick with the flu, you probably were more likely to die than today. But it's when it's popularized into an ideology that is shared by a lot of people, that it's a deprivation that affects us, and it's because of them. It's that format of a grievance, however real it actually is, that is likely to result in anger and radicalization and endorsement or engagement in violence.
So to 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 delve a little bit into the political reasons for disinformation, there are a couple of questions about, um, for example, is there a connection between labeling both Israel and Ukraine as Nazi regimes? And there's another question, since there was Tsarist government involved in the protocols of Elders of Zion and the Russian government involved in the new Russian disinformation campaign, somebody asked, uh, is there any involvement the US government is involved in the QAnon conspiracy? So
You wonder if there's a
question.
conspiracy, not a conspiracy theory. Um, Okay, so I can only speak to facts, and I don't have any facts that support that the US government is involved. We do have, this is from both the social media giants' own data and from intelligence agencies. We do have information that the QAnon content was not initiated, as far as we know, but it was amplified by foreign governments, specifically Iranian government, Chinese government, and Russian government. There are identifiable patterns of data manipulation by troll factories and bots and things like that that spread the message of QAnon. Um, there are some government adjacent operatives that helped popularize QAnon, most notably General Flynn, who is not in the government right now, but he was, and he's still a general. That's the information I have. I would rather not spin a conspiracy theory of my own. And as far as the Nazi, so I think the word Nazi acquired a connotation that is as bad as calling somebody a monster or a cockroach or a blood-sucking tick, right? It basically is a shorthand to saying that they have an evil essence. And if I would, if I could wager money, I would put money that if I run a survey today and ask people what they think, a Nazi goes with, I would bet that they would associate being a Nazi with those things more likely than not. So it's going to that essentializing and evil essence that I was talking about when somebody's labeled as a Nazi.
We have time for one more question, and I'm going to give that. There were a number of more questions, but it was, yeah, I think you've answered most of the general questions. But our friend Mia Bloom has a question. Can you please comment on the Congress's recent elimination of funding to the State Department's Global Engagement Center? That was the agency focused on foreign disinformation. So maybe you can comment on something that we are not aware of there.
Well, now you know. Now you know. Um, yeah, Mia knows better than anybody that I'm not a politologist. I'm not a political scientist. I can't understand, let alone comment on the political winds. But I find that troubling because we have so much data, indisputable, corroborated by different allies, different countries, that there is a concerted effort by adversarial powers to spread disinformation and influence. And sometimes these efforts are quite successful. Like we know that Cambridge Analytica was not a government effort, but it was I froze. It was an effort that was quite successful in politically influencing the American public. So we know that they're doing it. We know that they can do it with some concerning effect, and that we're turning our sight away from it doesn't bode well for us.
Okay, so not being political, what can we do about that? Is this a speech your senator, or is this something that we need to advocate for to reinstate the State Department's Global Engagement Center?
I mean, okay, again, I'm not so well versed. I wish I could just answer that so that people could then go and do whatever needs to be done. But I hope that at least they walk away with the understanding of the power of disinformation to cause enormous amount of harm and death and suffering, and that we are in a time where there's never been a better time of trying to understand and prevent and mitigate this harm with the tools we can use with the internet. As easy it is to spread information, it's also incredibly easy now to study it and try to counter it. So, private organizations, private donors, private initiatives, as well as governments would do well to go in that direction, and I hope they will.
Thank you. Is there anything in the minute or so we have left? Is there anything that you didn't get a chance to tell us that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, last thing. So I often get questions from people, what to do if I encounter a person who believes disinformation? How do I disabuse them? And what I say to that is two things. One, never ever try to argue them out of their beliefs. Even if you win the argument, research shows that they will walk away and they will end up later believing more in their own position than yours. There's like a rebound effect. So don't do that. And I'm going to tell you what does help. It's going to sound weird, but there is good research behind it. One thing that helps is to say, I understand how you feel. So you're not telling them you believe them. You're not telling them they're telling the truth. But you can maybe understand that they're feeling angry, disenfranchised, isolated, uncertain. So it's a true statement. And if you can really try to get together with them on the emotional plane and leave the cognitive plane later, research shows that they become a little more open to a different worldview. I'm not telling you to introduce it later, but that person might come to you sometime later and say, I'm having doubts. and that will be your opening. But in that moment, just leave a seed with them of trust and a common shared humanity that will hopefully blossom into something later.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So much to think about as we enter the new year. So much to be aware of. I'd like to I'd like to thank Dr. Muscalenko for this insightful and wonderful talk. Our next Scholar Circle features, again, our friend, Dr. Mia Bloom, and the topic will be Common Ground, Where Extremists Converge. Please join us on Monday, January 13th at 7 p.m. That's Monday, January 13th at 7 p.m. Thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a happy new year, and we'll see you then on January 13th. Thank you again, Dr. Muscalenko. Thank you. Okay, good night.